All right, thank you. Great. All right, so today we have our second presentation by Yolo Audubon by Chris Torres. The last one was on flamingo evolution. It was great. And so today we're going to hear about uh, the this other presentation on the Cretaceous mass extinction. So Chris Torres is an avian paleontologist and evolutionary morphologist. His research focuses on questions about extinction and survivorship dynamics, evolution of beak function, loss of sensory systems, and the loss of niche space. Bird groups he's worked on include the pre-modern birds, like the so-called ratites and their flying relatives, rails, and flamingos, which are his favorites. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of the Pacific. So, without further ado, I'll turn it over to him.
All right, let me mute myself now. Sounds like it's working. Excellent. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for having me back. If you didn't catch my last talk, it was on flamingos, which are my favorite birds. This time, I'm going to tell you about my favorite little slice of time in Earth history, which is the end of the Cretaceous and the few million years in the immediate wake of that mass extinction event when bird evolution went absolute bonkers and most major groups of birds appeared within a 3 or 4 or 5 million year window, which in geologic time is insanely fast. Like you mentioned, I'm an evolutionary morphologist, and I'm especially interested in understanding how the shapes of birds have changed over time and how that reflects changes in their ecologies and also changes in the worlds around them that drives those changes, sometimes rewards them with insane biodiversity and sometimes punishes them with extinction. And today is going to have some stories about both of those possible outcomes. As a paleontologist, I study a lot of different groups, different times, slices of evolutionary time. Like you mentioned, one of my favorite groups is flamingos. I actually just came back from a meeting in Italy a couple days ago that was just on flamingos for a solid 5 days, which was great. It was the first time I've ever really been around people who like to talk about flamingos as much as I do. And being on the receiving end of that, it was not nearly as annoying as people keep telling me that it is. So it was a lot of fun. So really interested in flamingos. I generally like tall, lanky birds for some reason. And so another group that I'm interested in are paleognaths, including the big flightless ratites, ostriches, emus, rheas, and their flying relatives, the tinamous, including the giant moa, which you can see here. And like you mentioned, I am really interested in loss in general, the evolution of loss, especially things that historically in the history of that lineage would have been a really great thing to have, like the ability to fly. Being able to fly is great. I'm guessing if I polled the audience, most people would want flight as their superpower. It's really great. Why would you lose the ability to fly? It's happened a bunch of times, including in ratites, 6 or 7 independent losses of flight, which means that at some point a long time ago, this group just would not stop losing the ability to fly. And I think that's really interesting. And that has informed some other things that I look at, like the rails. Rails are a group of birds that, let's go. They are a group of birds that, for whatever reason, just won't stop losing flight. There's something like 200 known species in the world today. At least 20 species have lost flight completely independently from all the others, including some species that have lost flight multiple times, which I think is really interesting. And they are doing that pretty much as we speak, which means that studying them is a really great model for understanding how it may have happened in the past. And so that's one of many groups that I'm really interested in. So these are other things. You can consider this a menu of things that I might come back and talk about, including the ratites there in the middle. I'll be touching on them today, but I do a lot with them very, very broadly. So today I'm going to talk about, again, my favorite little moment in time, which is the end Cretaceous mass extinction. And I like to start talks like these with an example of the kinds of questions that I find really interesting, especially if I know that in my audience there are people who probably spend parts of their times around young people who are really curious about the world and who maybe themselves are thinking about becoming a scientist themselves. And I like to do this because I think that it dispels a common misconception about the kinds of research questions that scientists like myself study. I'm guessing, thank you. I'm guessing that if there's any other scientists here in the audience, you can relate to me when I say that the kinds of questions that really drive me are not particularly sophisticated. I would call them kind of dumb. I think another misconception is that dumb is inherently bad. Dumb, I think, is it whatever you do with it. I think that silly, dumb questions can lead to really important answers. And largely what I'm driven by are really silly questions, maybe really obvious questions. But I think what that really gets at is just a general curiosity about the world is really all it takes to be a scientist. And so, to give you an example of the kinds of things that I'm really interested in, and an example of the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about today, I don't know why we've got this screen over here, but that's fine. 68 million years ago on planet Earth, this is a couple million years before the big end Cretaceous mass extinction event. Very famously in North America, we had Tyrannosaurus Rex, which was one of the largest known terrestrial carnivores ever discovered. At the same time, in Antarctica, we have a duck, or what is very closely related to ducks. This is Vegavis. I'm going to be talking a lot about him today. That fascinates me. This means ducks coexisted with T-Rex for at least a short time on this planet, which I think really emphasizes how incredibly long-lived some lineages are today that might seem otherwise a little bit mundane. Ducks coexisted with T-Rex. But I think what's even more interesting about this is that only a few million years later, the end Cretaceous mass extinction occurs, which was triggered by what's called the Chicxulub impact event, when an asteroid larger than Mount Everest collided with Earth just off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, off the coast of Mexico, triggered a mass extinction event. And of these two lineages, only one of them survived, and it was not the big, scary T-Rex, which I think is a pattern that's really fascinating. Patterns that run counter to what we would expect. Patterns like this, where T-Rex, unquestionably a complete badass, but when the world is on fire, it's the ducks that survive. So for some reason, ducks could take an asteroid to the face and they're still here, but T-Rex wasn't. Why? Why would that be the way that nature plays out? Patterns like that and ridiculous questions like that are why I'm really interested in what it is that I do. And so today I'm going to tell you a couple short stories about how my various aspects of my research focus on kind of this moment in time, what happened before, during, and immediately after that event. But the first thing I want to do is I want to establish some of the terminology that I'm going to be using. A lot of the terms, a lot of the names that I'm going to be using are going to be very familiar to a lot of you. I'm guessing that a lot of you will use some of these names very regularly just in your day-to-day life. But what I have found is that when you enter, when fossils enter the equation, the names, the definitions of names, how you use names change a little bit. Also, some of these names are just used in different ways by different people. And so I find that it's very useful for me to establish up front the way that I will be using some of these names. For example, the name aves. I'll be using the name aves to reference extant birds. These are modern birds This is the most recent common ancestor of all living birds and all of its descendants. If we look at aves, if we look at the ancestor of all of living birds, that ancestor gave rise to two major lineages that we can still see in the world today. One of those lineages are Paleognathi, which again are the big flightless birds in the world, as well as tinamous. Today, paleognaths are known from fewer than 100 living or recently extinct species. By recently extinct, I mean these are species that went extinct sometime during recorded human history, which I'm sure everyone here realizes that with birds, that is a depressingly high number. So paleognaths are known from fewer than 100 species. If we look at that early ancestor and we look at the other side of that early divergence event, the other descendant gave rise to neognaths, which are known today from well over 11,000 species, including my favorites. And that is a staggering diversity, a staggering disparity in biodiversity. I'm going to see if I can move this over to my screen. Oh, wonderful. Okay, go away. Okay, neognaths and paleognaths. The reason why I wanted you to be able to see the word neognathi is because the meaning of that name, neognathi means new jaw, paleognathi means ancient jaw. We're going to interact with the meanings of those names here today in what I think, what was to me a very surprising way. Okay, so we've got these two major lineages, staggering disparity in biodiversity between these two lineages. This means one of the two descendants of that ancestor of modern birds only gives rise to less than 1% of extant species biodiversity. That is another pattern that I find really interesting, and it's another thing that we're going to touch on very briefly today. If we step outside of aves and we look at where aves sits relative to their ancestors. If we look at how aves relates to other dinosaurs, this requires me to define another word that probably doesn't seem like it needs to be defined, which is birds. Nowadays, the word birds, very easy to define, at least based on traits, right? Birds have feathers, beaks, they fuse up various parts of their body. They've got a short bony tail. They use the syrinx to vocalize, hollow bones, furcula, right? All of the things that define a bird. What we find if we look at the fossil record is that none of those traits are useful if we are trying to identify a bird. Feathers, hollow bones, a furcula all arise long before birds. T-Rex had a wishbone. It had hollow bones. It may have had feathers. A toothless beak, a short tail, fused up arms and legs. Those all come long after birds. The earliest birds did not have a short tail. They did not have a toothless beak. So then the question becomes, okay, so then what actually defines a bird? If we look at the fossil record, what actually defines a bird? A recent paper came out and provided this definition. Their definition is a dinosaur with feathered wings that are homologous to those of extant birds and used for powered flight. To translate, that means that a bird is a bird if it flies like a bird. That sounds like circular logic, but actually, flying like a bird is a really shorthand way of describing a very complex arrangement of the bones of the wing and the ways that those bones move relative to each other. The powered flight stroke requires a lot of really hardcore modifications of the forelimbs that we can, as far as we can tell, observe in the fossil record. So having a bird-like powered flight stroke seems to be the only really confident way that we have of identifying what a bird is in the fossil record. So what all of that means is that we know that aves were not the only birds that ever existed. For example, most folks have heard of Archaeopteryx, which is the earliest known bird. It lived in the Jurassic of Germany about 150 million years ago. The name aves is the name that I'm going to use to refer to all birds, period. This is anything that meets this definition of bird. This includes aves, which are again extant birds or modern birds, but also it includes a lot of what we would call pre-modern birds, which means that these are birds that are lacking a lot of the morphological, the anatomical traits that define a modern bird. If you know your phylogenetics terminology, these would be called stem birds. I'll be using the term pre-modern bird because I think it does a pretty good job of reflecting really the meaningful differences between early birds and modern birds. We're going to talk about what some of those pre-modern features were when we zoom in on one of these birds. Some of you may have heard of some of these birds before. Confuciusornis was an incredibly abundant bird in the Cretaceous of China. Hesperornis was this loon-like bird, grebe-like bird that was an incredibly highly specialized swimmer to the point where it pretty much lost its forelimbs completely. It just had a humerus and nothing below the elbow. Ichthyornis is something I'm going to talk about pretty extensively here in a second. If we step outside of aviale, we have non-bird dinosaurs, things like T-Rex and Velociraptor. As far as we know, as far as we can tell presently, Aves is the only lineage of birds only lineage of dinosaurs, including other birds, to survive that end Cretaceous mass extinction event. And that pattern, the fact that there's all of this extinction, all of this diversity, both within birds and outside of birds, that comes to an end at the end Cretaceous boundary. And then suddenly, immediately after, we get even more bird and dinosaur biodiversity. That's a really fascinating pattern to me. So today I'm going to tell you 3 short stories about various aspects of my research that all touch on that phenomenon. The first thing I'm going to tell you about is some research that some colleagues and I have been doing, looking at trying to understand what traits may have allowed birds, aves, uniquely among dinosaurs to survive. This is going to touch on some innovations in brain size and shape that we detected by looking at the fossil record. Next, I'm going to talk about aspects of evolution of bird foraging strategy and how that may have played a role in how modern birds may have survived this mass extinction. And then finally, I'm going to talk about, we'll end on a somewhat optimistic note and talk about success after a mass extinction. We'll talk about how a really marked adaptation in beak morphology, functionality of the beak, seems to have allowed birds, and especially neognaths, to explosively diversify at the end of the Cretaceous. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is what we found to be a really surprising interplay between cognitive capability, intelligence, for lack of a better word, and extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. Also, if anyone has any questions, you're always welcome to interrupt me, so it's not just me talking at you guys. So you are more than welcome to ask questions as they come up. I like to have more of a conversation than just me talking. Okay, so here we're going to look back at birds and their close relatives. And here I'm going to emphasize a particular bird called Ichthyornis. So Ichthyornis was a pre-modern bird from the late Cretaceous of North America and Europe. It had a lot of characteristics that are again, characteristic of modern birds. It had a relatively short bony tail. A lot of bones in the arm and leg skeleton were completely fused up. It did not have a toothless beak. It retained most of its teeth, although the very tip of the beak was starting to lose teeth at this point. So Ichthyornis is a pre-modern bird, but it's a really important pre-modern bird because it is 1 or 2 steps outside of living birds. It is a close, think like first or second cousin to living birds. Things like Ichthyornis, things that are very closely but not a part of living birds, are crucial for helping us understand what aspects are actually unique to living birds. If we look at living birds, there's all these characteristics that only they have, but there's no way of knowing without looking at the fossil record which of those characteristics are unique to living birds and which of those characteristics arose prior to living birds. Those are really important traits to know about, because if we are trying to understand what traits mediate survivorship through a mass extinction event, we inherently need to identify traits that are present in the survivors but are absent in the casualties. Ichthyornis is a casualty. And so if we understand what is true about Ichthyornis, we can have an idea of what was true or maybe not true about earliest ancestors of modern birds. So Ichthyornis is this really important keystone species that's going to help us understand what's truly unique to living birds. Ichthyornis is one of the best known pre-modern birds for a number of reasons. It is known from a lot of fossil localities around, especially North America. If you are a fossil and you want to be discovered, it is great to be in a very rich country because we have the monetary resources and we have the privilege of being interested in things that seem as meaningless as things that were alive a long time ago. Ichthyornis is one of those things. It's also known from an incredible number of specimens. We have a ton of specimens, but up until relatively recently, Ichthyornis fell into a trap that virtually every other pre-modern bird fell into, which is that it was small and fragile. Birds are generally small and fragile. If you were trying to survive for dozens of millions of years in the fossil record, being small and fragile is the worst thing that you can be. What that means is that most, until this point, all of the fossils of Ichthyornis that preserved any part of the skull were crushed. They were flattened, which meant that a lot of really important detail was lost. A couple years ago, some colleagues and I published a new specimen of Ichthyornis, the skull of which you can see here. This is the skull. We're looking from the right side. It's one side of its mandible is here. Its mandible was split in half and separated. That's what's going on down here. Ichthyornis was really weird because it represents a very brief moment where the two sides of the mandible were not completely fused for a reason that we do not understand. It's only for a brief moment. Early birds and modern birds, the lower mandible, the mandible is fused left and right. Here, it was not. It was soft. It was joined by a strong joint, but it wasn't fused by bone. What that means is that very often you see the mandibles being separated. That's what we see here. So this is easily the most complete skull for an Ichthyornis ever published. There was a few years prior to this paper, a research group got together and they took literally every previous fossil that had been a skull fossil from Ichthyornis, and they put it together like a big Lego set to see, okay, how much of these skull can we build? It was about 75% as complete as this one individual. So this individual started giving us a ton of really interesting insights into the skull. One of the really cool things was that its skull, its brain case, the back of the skull that holds the brain, was preserved partially in 3 dimensions, which means that when we took a CT scan of that skull and we looked inside, we saw direct evidence of brain shape, which is what's shown here. This is a 3-dimensional X-ray. What's highlighted in pink is a reconstruction of the external surface of the brain of this bird. So to give you an idea of where this data comes from, birds are super smart, just like mammals. That means they've got really large brains. That really large brain is really convenient for a number of reasons. It makes them really smart, but it also means that the skull wraps very tightly around the brain, which means you can either take the skull physically or, in my case, take CT scans of that skull, 3-dimensional X-rays. You can take a model of the skull and then you can fill in the space where the brain goes, remove the skull, and now you have an incredibly high resolution reconstruction of what the external surface of the brain looks like. To give you an idea of the kinds of information we can get from that, this is a ratite brain shown from the left side. So in this case, the animal would be looking to your left. And major features are indicated here. We can see the cerebral hemispheres, the cerebellum, the optic lobe, which, as the name would indicate, was a major player in vision in birds, the pituitary down here. We can see the inner ear, the semicircular canals, and the cochlea, which are involved in the processing of hearing and the processing of their sense of balance. We can see major nerves passing out of the brain, like the olfactory nerve up at the front there, and the optic nerve and the trigeminal nerve out here. We can even see a lot of vasculature that leads into the brain. What all this means is that we can, again, reconstruct the outside of the brain. Inherently, there are limitations to this approach. The brain is a complicated structure. There's a lot going on below the surface. This is just us looking at the external surface. So there's a lot that we cannot unlock. But a lot of research has shown that just from external features, we can make pretty solid predictions about what's going on below the surface, at least at very coarse levels, which means that making interpretations of things like this is really useful for helping us understand what the sensory and cognitive experiences of things that have been dead for millions of years was. So we applied that approach to the brain of Ichthyornis, which you can see right here, color-coded based on major brain regions, cerebrum at the front, those are the cerebral hemispheres, optic lobe and the cerebellum here at the back. This brain is not supposed to look like that. It is severely crushed. The skull was severely crushed. So there's a lot of really fine detail that we are not getting. But what we can see is the overall shape of the brain. We have an idea of approximately where features are in the brain relative to each other. So to give you an idea of what all of this means, if we take this reconstruction of Ichthyornis's brain and we put it into a larger context where we are looking at the same kinds of information from other organisms, this is the pattern that we see. So all of these brains are color-coded, again, based on their brain region. And so to give you an idea, again, of what we're looking at the top here, we have two representatives of modern birds. In the middle here, we have Ichthyornis. We have the brain from Archaeopteryx, which again is the earliest known bird, up until this paper was published, and one other paper that came out since then. Archaeopteryx was the only pre-modern bird that had a skull preserved well enough that we could get brain data out of it. So when we published this study, Ichthyornis, out of the hundreds of birds that we knew about from the Cretaceous, Ichthyornis was number 2. Something that's really convenient about that is that Archaeopteryx is where birds first begin. Ichthyornis is where birds end right before modern birds appear. So if you're only going to have 2 birds from the hundreds that are available, those are easily the best to have. So we were very convenient, or we were very fortunate that this was there. Something to note here is that there's a gap in the fossil record from all of those species that we do not have direct data from. I'm going to skip this for a moment. This changed a couple years ago. This changed last year, actually. This paper was published towards the end of last year. This was a paper that published another pre-modern bird. The only reason I'm going to point this out is because it helps fill that gap that I just indicated, which is going to support the pattern that I'm about to show you, where this is the brain that they reconstructed there. Something to note here is that this brain shape overall is more consistent. I'm going to get into what these actual differences mean in a second, but just very generally, this brain shape is more like what we see in Ichthyornis and Archaeopteryx down here than what we see in Neognathus, modern birds up at the top. I'll explain what those differences mean largely in a second, but just generally, if you're looking at overall shape, the shape of this thing is more like other pre-modern birds. All of that is to indicate that there was very little modification of this overall brain shape going from Archaeopteryx to Ichthyornis. Basically, all of these pre-modern birds have more or less the same shaped brain. That cerebral hemispheres, the cerebrum here, which is shown in yellow, was much larger than non-bird dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus rex. Also, velociraptors in Jurassic Park, velociraptors are shown being very smart. They probably were not nearly as smart as even pre-modern birds were. But those cerebral hemispheres are not nearly as big relative to the rest of the brain as they are in modern birds. The cerebral hemispheres are where the cerebral cortex is. That is where higher cognition happens. That is where problem solving, complex memories, complex language processing skills, social skills, tool use, all of that is happening in the forebrain. And in modern birds are why they are so smart. Our giant cerebral hemispheres, which is again like 1 or 2 steps outside of modern birds, has a brain that is lacking those really large cerebral hemispheres that we see in modern birds, which suggests that having this really advanced brain is something that is unique to modern birds. This is something that only aves has, that no pre-modern bird, as far as we can tell, and it's very unlikely that we will find a pre-modern bird that has a brain comparable to what we see in modern birds. Generally speaking, that corresponds to expansion of the cerebrum and presumably whatever cognitive abilities went along with that. Yeah.
some information recently that neuron density is greater in vertebrates?
Yes. So recent studies have been looking at neuronal density, both abundance, the absolute number of neurons, but also the density of neurons in birds. And they have found that some, especially corvids, those levels of neuronal density are just off the charts. They are beyond most mammals, with the exception of some higher primates. So they are just absolutely off the charts. Something that we see in birds that we don't see as much in mammals is there is a really nice continuum of brain complexity versus what we see in humans in particular. There's a huge gap in cognitive ability between humans and everything else. Birds, there's a nice cleaner gradient, both with respect to anatomy, but also neuronal anatomy as well, which means that studying the evolution of bird intelligence holds potential to be a really powerful model system for understanding how human intelligence evolved. Yeah. Okay, so what we see here is that, again, expansion of the cerebrum. And so that led us to hypothesize that a shift in brain function associated with those expanded cerebral hemispheres was likely very strongly linked to end Cretaceous survivorship. Aves, modern birds, were the only dinosaurs that had these expanded cerebral hemispheres. And so we think that means that when the world is literally on fire, what you do for a living is now on fire. Your options are either figure out how to do something else immediately or you go extinct. And this suggests that aves, modern birds, were the only dinosaurs who had the cognitive capacity to modify their own behavior in such a way that they survived. No other dinosaurs, including these pre-modern birds, seem to have had the cognitive ability that modern birds had in response to that environmental cataclysm. Almost certainly there were other factors at play as well. Having a toothless beak is really convenient because the beak can adapt much more quickly than a jaw full of teeth. Being small probably played a pretty big role, but some more modern research is showing that body size was not nearly as important for birds as we previously thought it was. But all of those things, there were other birds that were small in the Cretaceous. There were other birds that didn't have teeth, that had toothless beaks in the Cretaceous. They didn't survive. Only aves with their gigantic brain survived. And so we think that this is probably a pretty good candidate for a really strong feature that helps explain, at least among dinosaurs, why only birds survived that end Cretaceous mass extinction event. Yeah.
Why is beak evolution faster than dog?
So it is a lot. This corresponds especially to dinosaurs, because dinosaur teeth are different from mammal teeth. Mammal teeth are differentiated. We have different teeth, and that means that individual teeth can change shape in a bunch of different ways, which is highly adaptable. Dinosaurs, their teeth were fairly characteristic, highly stereotyped, even among large genera and families. You had one kind of tooth, that was it. There was very little variety in the kind of tooth you had. What that meant is that those teeth could not evolve particularly quickly. Having a toothless beak evolves crazy quickly. And so that just meant that they could adapt more quickly. They could radiate more easily than other dinosaurs could have. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Mhm.
There's those teeth, the thing is absolutely a complete disaster, right?
Yes.
And so how the modern birds, so they have a larger cerebrum, that's very nice.
Yeah.
But right now, there's ash filling the air, filling their lungs. How is this brain gonna, so
Yeah.
they evolve in seconds if this is happening?
Sure.
It's dying in a matter of days.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. No, you're exactly right. So there are two patterns there that you're touching on that are patterns that are really active lines of research. One of those corresponds to the global pattern of environmental change that would have occurred. What we're starting to see as we look at the fossil record is that there is a very clear spatial pattern to extinction. The closer you were to that impact event, the more likely you were to go extinct almost immediately, the less likely you were to survive long enough to to adapt to that environment. The farther away you were, it's called the refugia hypothesis. The farther away you were, the more likely you were to survive. That is one major line of research. The second thing is touching on exactly what you just mentioned, which is no, you can't adapt quickly enough to that. But what you can do, if that's something that's available to you, if you can't change your anatomy, you can't change your overall ecology, but if you can change your behavior and do something that's slightly different, that is not ideal in the best of circumstances, but is at least something that is viable enough to keep you alive. That is what we're hypothesizing, is that having these big brains for those birds that were far enough away that they were not immediately vaporized, no, they couldn't adapt immediately their anatomy, but they could modify their own behavior. It's a behavioral plasticity. They had enough range in what they could do that even if their favorite thing to do is now on fire, I can't do that anymore, they could do something else that maybe would not have been as advantageous when the world was nice and clean. But now it gives them something when there's other things that just can't do anything. So we think it was a really strong interplay between those two things. But understanding how life responded, because we know it did, we know it survived. How did it survive? That is still ongoing research in a bunch of different with respect to a bunch of different aspects of biodiversity. Yeah,
Chris, could you please repeat?
moving across the end Cretaceous boundary, following a pattern that is easily the most common pattern that we see in the fossil record. We have pre-modern birds dying out at the end of the Cretaceous, being replaced by modern birds, which is really interesting. It's a really nice pattern to understand. But what we really are interested in, especially if we're looking forward to the mass extinction event that we seem to be careening towards with no clear interest in avoiding, we want to know how living things are going to survive and how they're going to respond. So understanding how pre-modern birds were gone, modern birds arose, that's great. But we want to find a case study in the fossil record where we can look at modern birds and see how modern birds themselves responded to this event. And so that's going to bring me to the second storyline here, where we are looking at waterfowl, very early anseriforms, and trying to understand how did anseriforms themselves, which again, we've established were around in the Cretaceous, how did they respond? And maybe how did they survive this mass extinction? So this project involved me publishing a paper that I was really scared to publish because I was wading into a realm of research that makes people really angry at each other. And that is based on a really frustrating pattern in the fossil record. Based on molecular studies where we can take the genes of birds, whole genomes, and we can, using that data, we can predict how long ago organisms diverged from each other. If we do that with birds, very clearly, a lot of the early major divergences among birds should have appeared in the Cretaceous. So this tree on the right side here shows relationships among birds. This red box here shows the Cretaceous, the Mesozoic, the end of the Mesozoic. Anything that's happening inside of that red box is something that should have been around during the Cretaceous. So here we're looking at things like paleognaths, galliforms, anseriforms, even early members of neoaves. There should have been a lot of early members of modern bird lineages that were present in the Cretaceous. The problem is we can't find them. We try hard to find those early fossils, to document what was a chicken-like in the Cretaceous, what was an ostrich-like in the Cretaceous. We can't seem to find them anywhere. At present, there are exactly 2 species of birds that have been found in the Cretaceous that can be strongly supported as being modern birds. There's about to be a third one that's literally about to be published in a couple months, but for now, it's 3. And even if you were to add that third new bird, I could hold all of the fossils that have been assigned to those 3 species in my arms at once. So that fossil record is tiny. And so even though we know that they should be around, we don't know where they are. And what that means is that if you step up and say, hey, we have one, people are going to say, no, you don't, prove it. And people are going to get into fights about it. That happens over one of those two species that I mentioned, which is a bird called Vagavis ei. It's named after the island off the coast of Antarctica from which it's found, which is highlighted in red up there. It's called Vega Island. Vagavis is, as far as we can tell, a modern bird. When it was first described, prior to a paper that we just published earlier this year, there were two known specimens of this thing. There was a lot of debate over what it was. When it was first described, people thought it was a duck. Then people said there's no way it's possibly a duck. This was frustrated by the fact that we didn't have the skull. If you're trying to identify what something is, having the skull, really important. We did not have the skull. All we had was one little trace of the lower mandible. So the right back side of the jaw where it articulates with the rest of the skull. That's all we had of the entire skull. I'm a part of a larger group called the Antarctic Peninsula Paleontology Project, where we are focused on trying to better understand the fossil record of Antarctica, because it preserves a lot of really important rocks that are really important for understanding what happens across, especially the end Cretaceous Mass Extinction. Back in 2011, a expedition went to Antarctica specifically trying to find the skull of Vagavis, because we know that's the linchpin. That's really what's going to clinch whether or not this thing is a modern bird. On that expedition, one of our members, Eric Roberts, who is a geologist, he's not a trained paleontologist, but something that you learn very early on if you're a paleontologist, make friends with good geologists, because geologists will help you understand everything that you find. So we brought along Eric Roberts here, and he found this chunk of rock, which you can see right there. It's a big, like slightly large football-shaped piece of rock that was broken into two pieces. And he saw little splotches of color. You might be able to see little splotches of color on this thing. There's a bit right here. He saw these splotches of colors and he said, there's a bird skull in here. And we said, there is not. There's no way there's a bird skull. There's no way that we found exactly what it is that we wanted to find. That's not how paleontology works. So we all said, there's no possible way. He said, yes, there is. And so we collected it just to humor him. And then after working on it physically for like 5 years, a researcher at the Carnegie Museum spent 5 years with a tiny little hand drill, a tiny little hand jackhammer, an air scribe, clearing away the fossil. Then another several years working with CT scan data of the fossil, trying to clarify what it was. We ended up with this. It is a bird skull. It is a almost complete bird skull. It was exactly what we wanted to find. It had part of the back jaw that overlapped with the piece that we had found before, almost identical. So very clearly, it's the same species of Vagavis. Very clearly, this thing is a bird, a modern bird. So we published this a couple months ago in Nature. This is a 3D model of the skull. Various parts are color-coded. What we saw when we looked at this thing, very obviously, it's a modern bird. Very obviously, this thing is an enceroform. It has certain aspects of the morphology that clearly are waterfowl. I'm not going to go into those aspects, but afterwards, if you want to know about them, I'm happy to go into detail. I am going to go into detail about one particular part of this anatomy, but we're going to touch on that in a second. But first, a different part of the anatomy I want to emphasize here. This is the back of the skull. We're looking at the back of the skull from the right side. So the bird here would be looking to your right. We've removed the front part of the skull. The back of the skull is not supposed to look like that. This is where that bit of the skull is just missing. But what I want to emphasize here is that there is this really large cavity it's a big depression on the back of the skull. That is what we call the temporal fossa. The temporal fossa in modern birds is an anchor point for musculature, specifically jaw adductor musculature. That is the musculature that lowers the that elevates the jaw. It's responsible for snapping the jaw shut. Having this enormous temporal fossa suggests that the musculature that was associated with it was absolutely massive. We only see morphology like this in things like grebes and things like loons, things that are adapted to underwater piscivory. There are few kinds of birds that need to close their mouths with the strength required to close your mouth rapidly underwater when you are trying to grab a fish. Water is highly resistive. Having really strong muscles helps you snap your jaws closed. We see that in things like grebes and in loons. This indicated that very clearly Vegavis also had really highly developed jaw adductor musculature. Vegavis was very clearly adapted in combination with aspects of its beak. Very clearly, this thing was adapted to underwater piscivory. It was an underwater, specifically leg-propelled diver that was living its life almost identical to a modern fish-eating grebe or a loon. This is not an ecology, this is not a morphology, rather, that we see in modern waterfowl. The closest we come are things like mergansers. Mergansers have approached this piscivorous lifestyle much more recently than things like grebes and loons. So it does have a part of the back of the skull where that jaw adductor musculature inserts. It's bigger than all other waterfowl, but is nothing compared to what we see in loons and grebes, and now what we see in Vegavis. So very clearly, at the end of the Cretaceous, Vegavis was a loon-like, grebe-like thing. It was doing what loons and grebes did millions of years before loons and grebes were doing what they do now. So if we step back and put this into larger context, this is now our reconstruction of what Vegavis would have looked like. It's standing up in a way that it almost never would have stood up. It also had a postcranial morphology. The body skeleton was very similar, again, to grebes and loons. Grebes and loons don't stand up because they look ridiculous. Vegavis would have had similar adaptations and therefore similar constraints on what it could and could not do as it's walking around. But this is a reconstruction of just giving you a general idea of what the body shape is like. When we tried to understand in a statistical context, so we know it's a waterfowl, but let's use statistics to try to figure out which known waterfowl, both extinct or extant, is this thing most similar to. We found that this thing is most closely related to another extinct waterfowl called Conflicto. That name corresponds to the fact that when this thing was found, there was a lot of debate over what this was, which is true about a lot of really early birds. Conflicto is from basically a neighboring island. If you stand on Vega Island, which is where Vegavis is from, you can see the island that Conflicto is from. They are from opposite sides of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. Vegavis existed just before, Conflicto existed just after it. Just like Vegavis now does something that modern waterfowl do not do, although mergansers are approaching them, Conflicto also did something that modern waterfowl do not do. Conflicto was very clearly a wading bird. It was obviously a waterfowl. It was clearly an inseriform, but its ecology was that of a wading bird. Its beak has been alternatively interpreted as being either a dabbler or a piscivore. Regardless, it was living a life that modern waterfowl generally don't occupy. It was either living life as a piscivore, like a modern heron or egret, or it was a wading filter feeder superficially similar to a modern flamingo. Nothing like what most modern waterfowl are doing. So again, this is highlighting a pattern where early waterfowl were doing a lot of really weird things before they settled on the relatively few things that they do now. But this highlights a trend that, to my knowledge, we have never seen before in the fossil record. Certainly not among birds, possibly not even among any known terrestrial vertebrates, which is that we have two very closely related species, not larger groups, specific species that straddle the end Cretaceous mass extinction. We have a loon-like diver immediately before, and we have this wading bird immediately after, in almost exactly the same place. Almost certainly whatever Conflicto is would have been present just before this mass extinction as well. Vegavis, we're not so sure about what happened afterwards. The point is that this highlights the fact that this one particular fossil locality has a particular feature that no other known fossil locality records, which is turnover, not from early birds to modern birds, but within modern birds themselves. And so this is the first evidence that shows this fossil locality may be a great place to try to understand how does a fully modern lineage of, in this case, birds, respond to a mass extinction. Pre-modern birds are gone. Modern birds are still here. These are modern birds that are experiencing that mass extinction, and we can, so far as we can tell, watch what happens to them. These are just 2 data points. Literally, they are 1 skeleton for Conflicto and now 3 for Vegavis. So this is a starting point, but it highlights how incredibly and unexpectedly important this fossil locality is going to be for helping us understand what larger scale faunal turnover patterns might be like in future mass extinctions, especially among modern birds like waterfowl. Any questions about that before I move to the last little bit of my story here? Yeah.
Really cool stuff. First off, with especially I like how you threw in the Merganser example as reference. And like how they don't have that much of a temporal process as something like a lunar cream.
Yeah.
One thing I also think about is they do have all waterfowl have present day modern waterfowl have lamellae and such. In the case of Mergansers, they have not really teeth, but the lamellae are more like serrated.
Yeah.
And of course, it's keratinized. It's not bone. What is there ever a possibility that question might maybe if they gave us or Conflicto may have had lamellae like that?
Yes. Yeah. So the question was about So the question was about the softer tissue structures that are present in bird beaks, specifically the keratinous beak. In modern waterfowl, we see a lot of elaboration on the shape of the beak that we don't see in the actual skeleton. So the question was, is it possible that something like Vegavis or Conflicto could have also had those same things? The answer is yes, absolutely. It is possible that Vegavis had serrations similar to what we see in Mergansers that would have given it an edge when it was trying to grab things out of the water. We don't know. Similarly, with Conflicto, it's possible that if it really is a dabbler, like some people have said, presumably it would have had the elaborate keratinous filtration mechanism that modern dabbling ducks have. It is really difficult to determine that from the fossil record. Sometimes you're lucky and there are large structures that are only present if the filter feeding structure is there. Here I'm specifically thinking about flamingos. The beak of a flamingo is incredibly highly derived. The only reason their beak is going to look like that is if they are filter feeding in a very specific way. There are other cases where if we look at the microstructure of the bone that the beak connects to, sometimes there are clues in the microstructure of the bone itself that can indicate, okay, something big was attached there. And so the bone had to accommodate that. To my knowledge, no one has looked at that in these species. I know they haven't done that with Vegavis because we had the only one. Conflicto, people are starting to do more stuff with it. But I don't know if we would even find anything if we look. So yes, it is absolutely possible that the shape of the actual shape of the beak, the jaw, is going to be slightly different from what we see. And certainly that's going to influence what their ecology was. But based on their, especially postcranial morphology, the range of things that having those elaborate structures would have allowed them is going to be fairly constricted. For Vegavis, clearly it was a leg propelled diver. It has all of the same specializations that we see in loons and grebes independently. So whatever its beak looked like, it was going to fit into that context. Similar with Conflicto, clearly it's a wading bird. So whatever it had going on with its beak, it's going to fit into the context of what could it do while it was wading. But there are a lot of aspects that we possibly never will really be able to reconstruct. Yeah. Any other questions about that bit? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Great question. So the question was, what was the overall ecology? What was the climatic circumstances of Antarctica when these things were alive? The answer is that it was incredibly green. So at the time, Antarctica was still connected to South America and Australia. South America is the important bit there because that meant that relatively warm water and air could make its way down south and wrap around Antarctica. Today, one of the main reasons why Antarctica is frozen is, number one, the fact it's over the South Pole, but it's been there for 100 million years. It has only frozen over in the past 35-ish million years. The dominant cause is the fact that Antarctica is surrounded by what's called the circumpolar current. It is a current of cold air and water that spins around Antarctica like a force field, keeping out warm air and warm water, which has allowed Antarctica to freeze. That current did not exist in the Cretaceous. So warm water and air was making its way down south. And so we had what we could call temperate rainforests. So think Pacific Northwest, think British Columbia, think Tasmania. Not particularly warm, but incredibly humid and incredibly green. So massive forest ecosystems, very completely different from what we see now. It would not have frozen. So this again was around 68 million for Vegavis, closer to 63, 64 for Conflicto. Antarctica didn't really freeze until about 35 million years ago, once Antarctica separated from South America. So the ecosystem would have been highly conducive to really complex food webs, completely unlike what it is today.
So you're discovering.
Yeah.
Paleontology.
Yeah. Yes. So the question was is it paleontology that's telling us this? And yes, not only looking at the animals that were there, the animals were organisms. They were living in a world, and so they're going to be adapted to the world that they live in. And so we can gain clues from just the anatomy of the organism, what kind of ecosystem would have been in. But we can also look at various plant fossils that we find. We see leaves, we see bits of wood that very clearly indicate trees that are not the same species of what we see today, but very closely related, and therefore would have been functionally very similar. And so based on that and microfossils, the pollen record, pollen grains fossilized, and we can look at those pollen grains and predict what kinds of plants were around at the time. Yeah. Okay, so these were two stories about death. Kind of a bummer. So we're going to end with a story that's a little bit more optimistic, which is recovery. So as it turns out for AVs, when the world ended, that was the best day of their life. That was when they were able to explosively diversify. This is something that we literally just covered in my evolution class this morning, was a difference between how birds responded and how mammals responded to this mass extinction event. There's a misconception about mammals that they exploded in diversity immediately after the Cretaceous. That's not true. It took them about 10 million years before they really exploded. Birds, it was immediate. Within 5 million years, all the major lineages were here. And so what I'm really interested in is to understand, okay, well, what mediated that process? So here I'm going to reemphasize something that I think is really interesting, right? These early basal divergences among AVs, paleognaths, neognaths. This insane difference in biodiversity between these two groups. And so here I'm going to touch on the most common hypothesis explaining why this is the way that it is. That is still so I'm going to talk about a paper that we published a few years ago, where our findings were consistent with that hypothesis, but our findings completely swapped the way that we understand this system evolved. Something I want to point out here is, again, the names of these two lineages. Neognath means new jaw. Paleognath means ancient jaw. That corresponds to a key functional difference in their upper beak. On the right here, we have a really simplified cartoon of a goose skull representing neognaths. Here, the upper beak and the palatal skeleton, the skeleton of the bony palate, are highlighted in blue. The cranium is highlighted in gray. In modern neognaths, the upper beak is mobile relative to the cranium. The upper beak forms a mobile hinge, which allows them to move the upper beak in a way that's comparable to the way that they can move the lower beak. Not with the same range of motion, not with the same power, but they can still move it. In some birds, that is passive. If they bite down on something too hard, the upper beak flexes a little bit. But there are a lot of birds where they can actively do that. Parrots can use that to modify they can very closely fine-tune the shape of their mouth when they are manipulating fruits. Flamingos can do this when they're feeding upside down in the water. They're so adapted to having their heads upside down their upper beak is basically a functional lower beak. So all of that highlights the fact that in neognaths, the upper beak is flexible. There is a joint that I'm going to show you in a second on the inside palate that is mobile in neognaths. That is not true in paleognaths. In paleognaths, shown here, the upper beak is the same color as the back of the skull because it is immobile. It is rigid relative to the back of the beak. So if we look at the actual skeleton of these things, we can see what that feature is. So in neognaths here, you can see that there is a joint right here between this bone in red, which is called the pterygoid, and this bone on the right here, which in an adult, I'm showing here in blue and purple. The blue and purple is called the palatine. The red is called the pterygoid. It doesn't matter what they're called. The point is that they form more or less a mobile joint. You've got two structures up against each other. They can rotate against each other. In paleognaths, that joint, which you can see right here, the red and the purple there, those are the same elements. They are strongly overlapping. They are flat against each other, which is a terrible way of coming up with a joint that you would want to move. So it is the configuration of these bones that explains why paleognaths cannot move their upper beak. There's a reason I'm showing juveniles and adults here. The reason is that in neognaths, in juveniles, what's happening, it's a really bonkers developmental trajectory that I've never seen in really any other aspect of the skeleton. These two elements, the red and the blue element shown here in the juvenile, those two elements are the same bone. They are both part of a bone that we call the pterygoid. But over developmental time, after the bird hatches, that bone splits in two. And the front part of the bone, which is shown here in blue, fuses to a completely different bone. And that split point is now a joint. That is functionally the same thing as your humerus breaking in half. The bottom half fusing to your ulna, and that break is now what you call your elbow. It is an entirely new joint that forms in the middle of a pre-existing bone. I think that is bonkers. One of my ongoing projects right now is looking at the development of this system to try to better understand it. And I'm going to mention that here again in a second. There's a reason why I'm emphasizing this, and we're going to come back to this in a second. In adults, that bony, that free element, the blue element there fuses to the purple. Even though those are two different bones developmentally, we call them the same thing, the palatine. That's going to come up again here in a second. So again, this is the overall configuration here. Notice the names of these two lineages. Anywhere outside of aves, at pre-modern birds, any pre-modern bird that we had a good beak from, any other dinosaur, the upper beak, the upper jaw is immobile relative to the rest of the skull. So very obviously, the obvious conclusion there is that this feature, this mobile beak, is something that is unique to neognaths. That is why they are called neognaths. That new jaw is specifically this functionality. So the idea here is that ancestrally for modern birds, the upper beak was akinetic. It was not mobile. It was stiff, rigid against the skull. In paleognaths, leading towards neognaths, paleognaths have that ancestral feature. Neognaths have this new structure. This new structure is almost certainly why neognaths and not paleognaths explosively radiated at the end of the Cretaceous. Having that mobile upper beak is phenomenal for a lot of reasons. It lets them bite down on things harder than they could otherwise because it gives them a way of propagating stress across those bones without those bones fracturing. Also, the back of the skull, famously in all vertebrates, evolves incredibly slowly. And that's because the back of the skull holds the brain. Everything about the back of our skull, too, everything about the back of our skull is about preserving the function of the brain. That skull is not going to change. That part of the skull is not going to change unless the brain changes shape. And so the skull changes shape accordingly. If your upper beak is strongly connected to the rest of the skull, the upper beak is held back by the rest of the skull. But if you functionally separate those two things, Suddenly, the beak can evolve in crazy directions without having to worry about the back of the skull keeping up. So for that reason, we hypothesize that the commonly accepted hypothesis is that mobile beak is why neognaths exploded, but paleognaths did not. So this was the paradigm going into that paper that I just mentioned, where we reconstructed the skull of this Ichthyornis. So here I am going to show a different diagram. This is a diagram showing the bones of the skull. I've removed the back of the skull. So here we're just looking at, in the bottom left, that's the bird from the right. On the top right, we're looking at it from above, and then bottom right, we're looking at it from below. Something I want to emphasize here is a mystery bone. So this skull was crushed. You can get a sense of that in the photo at the top left there. And so what I did was I CT scanned this skull. I individually treated each of the bones of the skull and put them back together like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. And based on the shapes of those bones, it was pretty straightforward how those bones interacted with each other. When I put it together, I realized that I had every bone I expected to encounter accounted for, but there was one bone left over, which you can see here in blue, indicated by the label mystery bone. It's like when you put together a piece of IKEA furniture and you have a piece left over and you're like, where did this come from? That was what it was like for us. We had a bone left over that we could not account for. I was flummoxed by that. Where would this extra bone have come from? Every bird I compared it to, both in the fossil record and in modern birds that I compared it to, had nothing like this bone. This bone didn't exist. But then I realized I was making a mistake by only looking at adult birds. And when I looked at juvenile birds, I immediately found what I was looking for, which is that structure that I just showed you. That separate blue bone right there, which is what eventually fuses to the palatine, was that mystery bone. The presence of that mystery bone, the presence of that structure, which is called a hemipterygoid, but that's not really important. The point is that the mere existence of that structure suggests that that neognath-like palate was present in Ichthyornis. Ichthyornis very clearly had a mobile upper beak, which was shocking. It's unclear exactly how mobile its beak was, but it had the joint. It's like having an elbow. Some organisms can move their arms in different ways. The joint was there. It's unclear how it was using it, but the joint was there. This means that in that earliest, that closest relative of living birds, it's got a mobile beak, which suggests that our understanding of this evolutionary pathway is incorrect. This suggests that what has been the definition of neognaths for the past several hundred years, that name has been used, is incorrect. This is actually the evolutionary trajectory of that system. What we call the new jaw is the old jaw, and what we call the old jaw is the new jaw, which was super surprising. We do not know why this evolved the way that it did. The way we had it before made complete sense. The new structure is the good structure. Once it pops up, things diversify. But here, this is loss. The ancestors of paleognaths had the good structure, and then they lost it. And that loss is why they did not diversify at the beginning of the Paleogene after the Cretaceous mass extinction. This is baffling to us. We know that this has happened. Since then, multiple specimens of other closely related early birds have also found this same joint, which suggests that several close relatives of modern birds have this configuration, which has supported our hypothesis that this is actually the evolutionary pattern here. There's a lot of questions here that we didn't even know to ask previously. Why would you lose this? Why would that happen? It's a great thing to have. We know almost certainly that this loss would have happened during the Cretaceous. For whatever reason, so early birds, early neognaths were present in the Cretaceous, but they were relatively rare. They explode in the Paleogene. So what this indicates is that for whatever reason in the Cretaceous, this did not make a difference. Didn't matter whether you had a flexible upper beak or not. You were not going to win. But after the end of the Cretaceous, suddenly it makes all the difference in the world. So when paleognaths lost this feature, they lost it when it didn't matter whether they had it or not. But that meant that they were out of luck when all of a sudden it did matter. We still don't understand how that happened. No one has ever documented this system. So what I just showed you here is there's this trajectory from juvenile to an adult. We don't know the evolutionary pathway of this. We also don't know the developmental pathway of this. We know that this happens, but no one's ever written it down. And so one of my grad students right now is studying how this develops in the hopes that that'll help us understand how it evolved. But this is now our current understanding of how this jaw structure evolved. That's all I've got for you guys today. I have a billion people that I want to thank for all of the incredible work that they did helping me out with this. Now, if you got any questions, I really hope that I have answers. Thank you. Yeah, Sonia? No. We absolutely do not have a movable upper jaw. No mammal has a movable upper jaw. It seems to be something that is unique to this one particular group of birds, or a larger group of birds than we previously thought. But still, at some point, this did arise for the first time in birds, and it made all the difference eventually. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I agree with you. Sometimes the problem with him is that he's too smart, which is what makes him a dumb old dog. And something I hope that I have shown today is that things that are dumb are not necessarily bad. Having really dumb questions about the world is where I think some really cool science can come from. So sometimes having a dumb old dog can be a pretty good thing. Yeah.
We're not 100% sure that you're going to ask
Yes.
and where
Yes. So the question is, so this gets at the end Cretaceous mass extinction. And the question is, are we 100% sure that there was an asteroid? So I think where you're going is there's two questions. Number one, was there an impact event? And number two, is it connected to the end Cretaceous mass extinction event? We know that there was an impact event. We have found the crater. We have found the meteorite itself, at least its remains. For a long time, we didn't know where it was. We hypothesized that it happened. But it's under a lot of sediment and in way off the coast in the ocean. So it was really difficult to find. The coast of the Yucatan Peninsula off the coast of Mexico. So it's in the Gulf of Mexico, right off of the coast, but it's in the water, which meant it was really hard to find. So number one, we have the impact crater, we have the remains of the meteorite, but there are also at that layer in the rock record globally, there are a lot of indicators in rocks that could only be present if there was a big impact event. The number one record is the presence of a layer of an incredibly rare mineral element called iridium, which is normally on Earth. Iridium is exceptionally rare. It's a rare Earth element, but it's super common in asteroids. And right at the end of the Cretaceous, globally, there is what's called an iridium anomaly, which is a layer of a massive, an unthinkable amount of iridium that you can see virtually everywhere in the world that records that moment. The only possible way that that iridium could be there is if an asteroid exploded and the pieces of that asteroid made it up into the atmosphere, circled the globe, and then were deposited everywhere. So there is a lot of geologic evidence that suggests that that happened. The question that you didn't ask that I'm going to answer anyway is that how do we know it's connected to this mass extinction event? It was a huge explosion that would have caused impact winter, which is comparable to nuclear winter. So there's no way that you're going to get hit by Mount Everest and not be hurt by that. So almost certainly, with I would say 99% certainty, we can say that the one event, the impact, is what triggered the end Cretaceous mass extinction. There are some other things that wouldn't have helped. In India at the time, there were what are called the Deccan Traps formed, which is a large-scale melting of the Earth's crust, which would have resulted in insane amounts of volcanism. And that also would have hurt things, but it alone could not have caused the mass extinction. Most likely it was driven by that impact event, and it was made worse by all of this volcanism happening in India at the time. Yeah,
We have a question in the chat.
Go for it.
From Steve Hampton saying, would it be fair to say that the survivors of the meteor strike needed to be able to forage on the ground under litter and ashes, like chickens, ducks, and
yes, probably. Almost certainly that. So there's gonna be a lot of fallout. There's gonna be a lot of accumulation of sediment, of gross stuff that organisms are gonna have to filter through, they're gonna have to probe through. So anything that was adapted to that kind of lifestyle would have benefited. There are also other aspects of lifestyle that's probably played a role. Forests largely caught on fire. And so things that were not adapted, that were not reliant on living in a forest, would have done particularly well because their ecosystem, they could move to something else. If their previous home is on fire, they could move homes. So yes, almost certainly, at least in the immediate impact, the immediate aftermath of that impact, and by immediate, I mean probably thousands to tens of thousands of years, those organisms that were alive would have had to have been able to thrive in the newly created circumstances. Yes. Yeah.
So the fish do
Fish did okay in the end Cretaceous mass extinction. They were hit pretty hard. Something that we see overall in the history of the planet is that certain mass extinction events tend to affect either terrestrial or marine ecosystems, one more than the other. So marine ecosystems were hit pretty hard. Fish in particular seemed to do pretty well, but there were other aspects of the marine ecosystem that were hit really hard. Marine reptiles are gone. Ichthyosaurs were gone already, but plesiosaurs and mosasaurs were gone. There were a lot of cephalopods that died out, ammonites, things like that died out. So certain parts of marine ecosystems were hit incredibly hard. Fish would have suffered, but not nearly as badly as other things did that were living in the oceans. Yeah. Do you have a question?
Yes, and also a comment to the prior question about
Yeah.
and such, the layer. There's actually a part of it that is viewable here in Yolo County. If you go to the parts of the catchment water, you can find actually the actual layer there. And
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know about that. That's really awesome.
yeah. So this pretty much, if you go north of the Cape Dam to the upper part of the catchment watershed, there are some areas there where if you look into the rolling rocks that border the river, you can see that layer. Yeah. Yeah.
Just really quickly for people who are not here, I just learned something really interesting is that the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary rocks that preserve that are present here in Yolo. That's awesome. Very cool.
And now for the dumb question.
Sure.
Well, maybe I shouldn't say it's maybe just me trying to think of it.
Sure.
You know, with alienates and such, that primitive palette, I should say, quotations.
Sure.
The one that's interesting is like with all of them, they have a southern hemisphere origin, whether it's elephant birds or ostriches. Do you think there's something ecologically that could have been a selective pressure that made them, whether it was like vegetation communities, climate?
Sure.
Any ideas out there?
Yeah. So the question was about it was about the correct observation that paleognaths, big ratites, and tinamous are found, at least in the modern, exclusively among southern land masses. And so the question was, might there be something related to that distribution that could help explain why they did or did not diversify after the Cretaceous? My guess is that possibly that is the case. We, for one thing, we do see paleognaths in the fossil record in the Northern Hemisphere. We see them in Asia, in both Southern and Southeast Asia. I don't know that there are any in Europe, but there may be. But these are ratites. But we also know that, so something I didn't mention that I can talk about the next time I come is that we have a pretty good model for how paleognaths, modern paleognaths, achieved their distribution. Certainly, they achieved their modern distribution by dispersal by flight. The ancestors of elephant birds, of moa, of ostriches, of rhea, of cassowaries, of kiwi, they all made it to where they are now by flight, and then independently lost flight and became really large. We know that from a couple lines of evidence. If we look at their molecular, their genetics, if we look at their genomes, we can see that they diverged from each other long after modern land masses split apart and achieved more or less where they are today. So there's no way they could have gotten there by rafting. There's no way they could have gotten there by walking. The only conceivable way they could have gotten there is by flight, which means that fairly shortly after the end of the Cretaceous, within the next 10 to 15 million years, the ancestors of all of the ratites were flying. They were flying around the planet, generally making their way to southern land masses, and showing up in places where there were not yet large mammals, which was, again, that's basically what the early Paleogene immediately after the Cretaceous looked like. There were not a lot of large mammals around. It took them a while to get really large and really successful. When we look at birds today, birds that cannot fly, and we want to say, okay, so why did you stop flying? Almost always the requirements are that they show up, that bird shows up somewhere where there is no terrestrial mammal, large terrestrial mammal that either it will compete with or that can eat it. If that is the case, then they lose flight and eventually get very large. At the end of the Cretaceous, going into the Paleogene, that was the entire world. There were very few large mammal competitors or predators that early birds would have had to deal with. All of this is kind of getting away from your question. I don't think so. I think that what we see in modern paleognaths today, their distribution is a holdover from where they used to be in more places, and they have now become restricted to where they are today. So I would be surprised. I think it's certainly feasible that something about being in the South meant that they were not able to be successful. But I don't know that it played a particularly strong impact. Another reason is we know that there were a lot of neognaths that originated in the Southern Hemisphere and they blew up. So it would have played a role. It would have intersected with other things, but I don't think that it on its own would have been the reason. Yes?
Yes. When that meteorite happened to birds of this type, or was there one part of the world that had high survival rate?
Sure. Yeah. So the question was, what is our understanding of spatial response to that mass extinction? Do we know whether or not there were groups of organisms that were favored because they were far away? We don't know. Part of that is because there hasn't been much work looking at that, although some folks are. And part of it is because our understanding of what was happening at the time is just incomplete. As much as we know about life at the time, we know probably like 2% of what was happening at the time. And that would be the equivalent of trying to understand how birds achieved their modern distribution, only looking at 2% of those species, just the big ones. And so we are held back by a woefully incomplete fossil record. And so there are people starting to look at that. There are people who are using some pretty clever tricks with statistics to try to account for the fact that there's a lot of diversity that we're not seeing, a lot of species abundance and richness that we're not detecting. So they have these fancy statistical tools that help us try to estimate maybe how much we're missing. But that's all very preliminary. And so people are starting to look at that. But I don't know that we have any firm answers yet. Yeah.
It's big.
Mm.
And as far as Wyoming, with iridium in the gills of the fish in the fossil layer.
Yeah.
Isn't that right?
Yes. Yes.
You know that it radiated out that far at least.
Yeah, so we know, so this is also something that I just literally covered in class today. I'm really glad that you asked about this, because I am uniquely prepared to answer it. So impact event happens, that Mount Everest effectively vaporizes. That vapor goes up into the atmosphere and it circulates the globe. That iridium layer is everywhere on the planet. To give an example of that, every span of geologic time is defined by an event. The beginning and the end is defined by an event. The end of the Cretaceous, technically, scientifically, the official definition of the end of the Cretaceous, the beginning of the Paleogene, is the presence of the iridium layer in the rock record that corresponds to that impact event. In order for something to be useful enough that we can say this is what defines the end of a geologic span of time. It needs to be something that is abundant and global enough that no matter where we are, we can find rocks that we can correlate to that time period. So the presence of the iridium layer is so universal that it is good enough that we can use it to define the end of the Cretaceous. Specifically, the rocks that define the end of the Cretaceous are in Tunisia. So that far away, we have rocks that are the definition of that impact event. The impact event was in Mexico. So that gives you an idea, number one, of how widespread that was. But number two, how widespread, how global the impacts of that event would have been. Iridium was not the only thing in the atmosphere moving around. There would have been vaporized rock that was hitting the atmosphere and bouncing back in. There was insane amounts of CO2 and methane, which are entering the atmosphere. Methane in particular is an awful greenhouse gas. It's something like dozens to thousands of times more potent than CO2 when it comes to a greenhouse effect. Atmosphere is full of it at the end of the Cretaceous. Dust particles are blanking out the sun. There would have been impact winter where for an unimaginably long amount of time, photosynthesis almost drops to zero, not to zero, but tragically low, which is going to have knock-on effects along the entire trophic ecosystem. Primary producers plummet, primary consumers plummet, and on up the chain. So for all of these reasons, you're just seeing for 10 different reasons from 10 different directions, global ecosystems are just collapsing. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was specifically, what was it that caused the end of the dinosaurs? It was all of those factors hitting at once. It was initially it would have been devastation. There would have been like you said, tidal waves that are circling the globe. Globally, we have record of this in the rock record. Globally, there were magnitude 10 plus earthquakes happening everywhere on the globe. Again, all of that fire and ash and molten rock that's ejected up into the atmosphere falls back down. So no matter where you are on the planet, fire is raining from the sky. It's either killing you or setting what you eat on fire. And so things are dying either directly as a result of those things. In the oceans are acidifying to an insane degree. So we get ocean acidification and ocean ecosystems collapse. So dinosaurs would have died from all of those things at once. The impact event itself kills them, or if you're lucky enough to survive, most likely the collapse of your ecosystem is what causes you to die. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Right.
Don't be.
Back with a. That would be research. I'm just curious.
Yes. So the question was, how does AI intersect with my research? So it hasn't really entered very much yet. It is starting to enter in some really convenient ways. So generally speaking, AI should be a tool that makes the hard parts easier so that you can spend time on the fun parts. The problem with AI, aside from the resource required to use them, is that frequently AI is involved in making the easy parts easier so that all you are left to do is the hard parts. So far in paleontology, we seem to see the reverse. There are ways that we can use AI to automate otherwise very time-consuming tasks. For example, building 3D brains using CT scan data. That takes a really long amount of time. Building one of those brains that I showed you can take 4 or 5 hours if I just sit there and do it and nothing else. It takes a really long time. But increasingly, there are AI approaches to that where you can give AI data sets that you've already done. And then it can figure out, okay, based on what I'm seeing in this new one, here's what I think the brain is going to look like, which is a really good way of getting us through the time-consuming part to the fun part. So right now, that is largely where AI is manifesting for what I do. Hopefully, that will be the extent of it, but I don't know. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all. If you see more questions, feel free to talk to me. Otherwise, thank you all for having me.
You're fascinating, Tom.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Riley Black's book, have you read that?
I've seen it, but I
Day
have
of the
not,
Dinosaurs.
I haven't read it yet, but it's on my stack. Have you read it?
Yes.
What do you think?
Halfway through it. And
Okay.
here's my real personal question
Sure.
for you, which sounds just really stupid.
It's not gonna be. My answer will be stupider.
But no, it's a question that nobody ever thinks about.
These are the best questions. Those are the best questions.
I guess it actually makes me really sad.
Sure.
It broke my heart to read it.
Okay.
Because of just what you were talking about.
Okay.
The the heat in the air, all these
Yeah.
magnificent animals
Yeah.
lived for how many years did the dinosaurs? They lived longer
Right.
than, I guess we have sharks and we
Yeah.
have some insects.
Sure.
So they lived for 300 million years.
Yes.
And they are essentially gone.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
people will say, well, we wouldn't be here. Well, you know what? Part of me doesn't care. Part of me
Sure.
says, that was so sad.
Yeah, I agree. And
And I just wonder, do you ever get overwhelmed by this feeling of, oh my God, we lost so much?
a little bit. Yes, I mean, you would have to, if you're a robot, if that's not the case. I am really good at separating myself.
Compartmentalized.
Yes, and focusing on the
Okay.
cool parts.
Okay.
Number one, focusing on the aspects of those ancient ecosystems that I think is really cool, but more relevant to the modern day. My hope is that by looking at systems like this, we can look at patterns. We can look at how ecosystems responded in the past, that in ways that hopefully will allow us to make predictions about what's going to happen in the future, and maybe avoid a lot of the biodiversity loss that we seem dead set on causing. And so my hope is that from these really sad stories, we can learn some lessons that will help us mitigate the amount of damage that happens when we go through it again. So my hope is that from all of that pain and suffering, we might learn something that will at least minimize it in the future. So those are the things that you have to hold on to. Also, the fact that dinosaurs are really interesting. T-Rex is really cool. So if you focus on that.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
They're amazing.
What I take a little bit of comfort in is knowing that up until now, all of that was a largely natural process, whether it was something out of our control or whether it was biological in cause. It was never something that could have been avoided. It was just nature playing out. It's a large scale version of, it sucks to see the antelope get eaten, but do you want the baby lion to die or not? And so it's a large scale version of that. And so, yeah, absolutely. It's sad. Really what's happening now is really the part that makes me
I
sad.
know, it's hard for me. I have 2
Yeah.
degrees in biology. Now I'm a lawyer.
Yeah.
And I want to get a degree in ornithology, but I
That's
don't think
amazing.
that's going to happen. So does anybody audit your class?
You're always welcome to. I'll warn you, I'm down in Stockton, so it's a bit of a commute, but yes.
And what classes are you teaching?
So this semester I'm teaching a class on human anatomy, but more relevant, I think that for you would have been,
That,
yeah, I'm teaching a class called Life Through Time, which is literally that.
that's
We
fantastic.
start with the dawn of life. Thank you so much. I'm glad. Thank you. I tricked you. That's great. You fell for it. I'm glad that I was able to trick you into that. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
I have just one question.
Please.
I sort of come at this from a different aspect.
Yeah.
Phil, not later.
That's awesome.
One of the things that's really important is.
Yeah.
And I've been getting a lot of knowledge about it.
Yeah.
Wing structure.
Sure.
Of course, we.
Yeah.
Copy the bird.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
That's fast.
Studying the evolution of the wing has been really confusing as well, because we know that there are a lot of structures. You know better than anyone, there's a lot of structures that are crucial for aerodynamics. You're not going to leave the ground if you don't hit a certain shape. What seems to have happened is that those shapes arose prior to flight. That's weird. Velociraptor, there's evidence to suggest the Velociraptor had wings. Clearly, it was not flying, but it seems to have had a lot of the asymmetry that we associate with an airfoil.
Yeah.
What was it doing with that? We don't know. So the looking at the evolution of the wing and looking at how the shape has changed in concert with presumed aerodynamic functions, super fascinating, really puzzling. There's a lot of patterns that we do not understand, but are really, really interesting. Yeah.
We have a model out that's called an illusion.
Okay. Oh, that's awesome. That's great. Oh, that's really fascinating. Yeah.
What that was.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate you guys being here. Yeah. So this class is the history
I
of
got
life
free time at
period.
the end of 2026.
Okay.
Go pursue this.
Send me an email.
I was gonna ask if do you have a textbook you're using for that?
I do. I have book recommendations for sure.
That's great.
And I can send you all the lectures that I've done as well.
That's the one. That's the right.
Yeah. I haven't read it yet. I have it at home. I have several books at home, but I haven't read it yet.
It's very, you are there.
Yeah, that's
So they're-
awesome.
She's following or he
Sure.
is following
Yeah.
particular animals.
Right. That's awesome.
Day.
That's really fascinating. I'm excited to read that more so now than I was before. So thank you for that
Well,
recommendation.
It's also like, you've probably seen both the BBC and the other,
Yeah.
Walking with Dinosaurs.
Right.
Which to me, it's like, people don't realize that is incredible,
Yeah.
fantastic. I mean, the ones
Yeah.
where they did the
Yes.
flying dinosaurs,
Right.
it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's bonkers.
To create that, that's.
No, it's
that's
amazing. Yeah,
And people think those are for kids. It's like, that is
No
the
way.
most amazing
No.
thing. You recreated it.
yeah. It's amazing.
They absolutely
Yeah,
did.
and so seeing where all that data comes from is really interesting. So yeah, send me an email.
Okay.
Yeah, I gave it to you my email. It's CTORRES2 at pacific.edu. And I can send you the books that I use, and I can even send you the lectures that I use if you
Oh,
want to
this
see
would be
those.
great.
Yeah, of course,
At Pacific, you said?
at pacific.edu.
Got it.
Here.
Yeah, so send me an email and I can send you my resources.
That would be wonderful.
Of
Thank you
course.
very much. I
Yeah.
really enjoyed it. And
Yeah,
I've had this crazy idea for a long time. that,
do it.
Like I said, 2 degrees in biology, and then I ended up going to law school. I wish I mean, it's a passion. I've,
Do it. Go to
So,
it anyway. You're gonna
I
be thinking
think-
about science anyway, so do more of it.
yeah.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. So yeah, send me an email and I can send
Thank you so much.
Of
And
course.
anytime you're gonna be back here, or how,
Yeah.
what do you do?
As soon
What is
as,
your guest lecture?
as soon as Ken invites me back, I will come back. So this is on him. Yeah, right now I don't have anything scheduled, but I will let you know as soon as I
My
do.
name is Audrey.
Audrey,
Nice
lovely to
meet
meet you.
Thank you.
Yes. Sorry, I know you had a question before I cut you off. I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, you made it all happen.
So. I have kids.
Great.
I know but they will ask us,
Yeah,
Mom, where were the humans among,
Yeah.
when did the humans come along?
yeah.
When was the ice age? The humans were already there.
Yeah.
So you're
Yeah.
not there on the.
Yeah. So humans we're here like yesterday, basically. Homo sapiens is a species about 200,000 years. Yes, incredibly young. Yeah. So this would have happened this extinction event was 66 million years ago. At the time, mammals were tiny little baby things. They were really simplistic, really basic, comparable to rats. So they were not true rodents, but rodents is a good comparison. Cockroaches were definitely around for sure. Cockroaches have been around for a while. As far as dinosaurs were concerned, mammals were probably cockroaches. So they were around, they were relatively small, but relatively primitive. Then extinction happens, birds explode 10 million years after that. So now we're talking 56 million years ago. Then mammals explode, including primates. That's when primates first arise. We are primates. Primates continue to diversify over evolutionary time until a few million years ago, we start to see really early things that we can compare to humans, things like Australopithecus, right? So if you've ever heard of, yeah, so they are ape-like, they're human-like apes. So if you've ever heard of Lucy, the skeleton Lucy, that's when she was around a few million years ago. Million, yeah, a few, like 2 or 3, upwards of maybe 4. Then we start to see more and more early human, the genus Homo appears 1 or 2 million years ago. Homo sapiens as a species appear in about 200,000 years ago. We're extremely young. Yeah, there were a lot of humans around at the time. So like Homo Neanderthals originate in Africa before we do. They make it up to Europe and Asia long before we do. By the time Homo sapiens make it out of Africa and up into Europe and Asia, there's already humans there. There's already Neanderthals. And so we compete with and breed with Neanderthals, and then we emerge as victorious. And so we have eliminated all of our closest relatives because that's what we do as a species.
Already there.
Correct. Yeah, there have been several ice ages over the past. Technically, we are in an ice age now. An ice age is when we have standing ice. So technically, we're in one. It was much more extensive in the past. Even as recently as tens of thousands of years ago, there was much more extensive glaciation over the globe. Our ancestors would have been there. That's one of the ideas, is that Neanderthals were highly adapted to living in really cold conditions. They were adapted to living in Europe and Asia when the world was frozen. But as the world started to cool down, Homo sapiens, which were better adapted to living at lower latitudes like Africa, where it was a lot warmer, they started moving up. Because the world was moving away from what Neanderthals were good at, they were out of luck as Homo sapiens arose and kind of took their place.
So if somebody calls you a bird brain, that's actually a compliment.
It is the best compliment you can get. Yes, that is the take-home message, is that,
When you say,
yeah, it's the same thing.
gee,
Yes.
say, for sure, we were wrong.
Yeah. That is the story of so much of science in general, paleontology in particular, is us being, we're sure that this is the case. Oh, yeah.
And he said, yeah, the universe is contracting.
Yeah.
So I said, oh, that's the biggest blunder, made a mistake.
Yes.
You're right, universe is
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're a genius, because geniuses
Well, thank you.
find themselves.
Thank you for noticing. I appreciate that. Now I want you to tell that to everyone else that I know. That's great. Thank you for coming. Yeah, and feel free to reach out to Ken if you ever have any more questions. You can reach out to Ken and he can put us in touch. That's absolutely true. Yes, without question.
I just wanted to show you this comment.
Wait, oh, that's awesome. Whoa, that's cool.
This is Dylan Winkler.
Yeah. He was, he was in my, yes. I remember him vividly. And he was a student in my comparative anatomy lab. That's awesome. If you're still on, hi Dylan, that's great. That's cool.
Quite a few people.
Great. Yeah. Great. Well, I'm glad that it was